Now, for the longest time, real household disposable income per capita has been the metric for measuring living standards. And I got to thinking, does that make sense? Does it actually add up when you think about the changes to the composition of the population over time? Because, children, for example, 15 or 20 years ago made up a significantly larger proportion of the population than they do today. And generally speaking, children don't have incomes. And if they do have an income, it's relatively minimal. So, what I've done here is I've taken real household disposable income, and instead of dividing it by the total population, I've divided it only by people of working age. Now, what this shows is that basically there is there is no more disposable income on a per working adult basis today in inflation adjusted terms than there was in 2012. Now, it's also here that another distinction needs to be made. Over time, real household disposable income should, in an economy like Australia's, rise. Because technically speaking, the population is getting older and the population, generally speaking, is getting better educated. And as the population ages up to a certain point, the median worker is closer to their peak earnings than they were. So there is that particular factor that should be boosting it. There is also another one as well. If the workforce participation rate rises, if the employment to population ratio rises, that should see the amount of disposable income per working age adult rise along with it. If we look at real household disposable income per working adult and we look at how the employment to population ratio interacts with that, and we just take everything else out of the equation, just how things should have evolved in, say, the last 13 years since it was comparable back in towards the end of 2012, real household disposable income should be somewhere around about 4% higher today than it actually is. And that's solely based on that, not even taking into account those other aforementioned factors in terms of the aging of the workforce or the greater education of the workforce, the composition of the jobs. So I just think that it just goes to show that when you really start to drill down into it, even at an aggregate level, we are going absolutely nowhere.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, of course, that if you were to overlay inflation, well, inflation was quite low for a period of time and then shot up, and it's sort of coming down slowly, and you could almost see the counter positioning of that. But as you say, because of the fact that people were actually getting older and therefore, in theory, earning more, you would see some natural momentum. So basically, we have gone absolutely nowhere. And the other interesting observation here, this is per working aged adult. The other point to think about here is today there are a greater number of households with two people both working full time to try and get by. If you go back in history, it tended to be one full time and maybe one part time, or one full time. So there's another factor, and this is the thing that I get really frustrated about when people talk about the income calculations for mortgage repayments, right? Today, to be able to actually get any sort of a mortgage, you need two full-time incomes. Whereas if you go back in history, you didn't. So it's actually worse than this sort of headline picture might even suggest.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's the next level of granularity that I really want to get into with this data, just to see exactly. Even I think a good measure part might be the number of hours worked, perhaps. Just to sort of be able to better drill down into what the average person is actually getting from their labor. That's without even, as you mentioned, getting into things like housing. I mean, one of the really interesting things is I was doing this calculation the other day based on some historic housing prices and the historic interest rates from the RBA. Back in 1999, a single man on an average full-time wage could buy a starter home in Sydney on his own easily. Sort of a home at sort of 20% below the median. Whereas today, even two full-time incomes, even two full-time average incomes will not buy you that same house.